Well, it's a delight to be back with you again. Sometimes I'm up here, sometimes I'm down there, sometimes I'm up there, but it's nice to be back up here again. And as I look at the passage for this morning, it's a challenging parable, and I often think when Kim is doing up the schedule of who is to preach, he looks at all of the lessons and figures out which ones he does not want to preach on, and finds the low one on the totem pole and says, okay, Scuse, you got this one, okay?
Or I choose the most gifted preacher for the most gifted.
Smooth reframe. Well, let's look at this parable for a moment. Often when we think of Jesus' parables, we think of Jesus being all nice and sweet and gentle, and this one is a little bit tougher. Think of the context in Jesus' life as to when this parable was delivered. It was after Palm Sunday and before Good Friday, in all likelihood, when this parable was delivered. Remember Palm Sunday, not just the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, but also the cleansing of the temple. Remember Jesus going in and just upending everything and saying, my house is to be a house of prayer, and you have made it a den of thieves. Well, it's in this context that Jesus is giving this parable, and it's one of the very few full-length parables, I think there are only 3, that are delivered in all 3 of the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So for it to be in all 3 gospels, it must have been important. It is one of those parables where Jesus takes the gloves off and says, okay, I'm really going to say what I think. He knows that his life is about to end, and if there's a couple of things he wants to say, this is when he's going to say it. Well, as I think of this parable, I think I got 2 different sermons I can give here. One is the nice, light, fluffy one, where we all go home and feel pretty good about ourselves, and we go home smiling. That's one. That's the A sermon I can give. Or the B sermon is the one that's a little bit more challenging. And we go home and we don't feel quite so smug about ourselves. And we actually start to kind of challenge ourselves, and we go home a little more disturbed. So which one do you want this morning? How many want the nice, light, fluffy sermon this morning? Well, we got a couple in the front row here. Don't want to be challenged. That's okay. Well, we'll see where it goes. We'll see where it goes. All right, so for this parable, picture it. Ever rented out your property before? Ever had some renters that you weren't too pleased with? So here in the owner rents out the farm. And the renters coming in, they make this really shrewd deal. And the deal looks like this. We're going to come and live on your property, and we're not going to pay you a red cent until the harvest comes in. Pretty shrewd. So the landowner says, fine, okay. And then harvest time comes. Landowner sends one of his hired men and a big truck and says, well, here we are. We're here to collect the rent and our share of the produce. And the renters say, get lost. We're not paying you squat. And so the big burly guy and the big truck all go home empty. The landowner says, oh, not a good idea. So I don't like this. So the landowner sends 2 big burly guys and an even bigger truck and says, here we are. We've come to collect our rent. And they say, you can't make us. Na, 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 you can't make us. And so 2 big burly guys and even bigger truck go off empty. Finally, the landowner says, well, who's got maybe not the biggest personal power, but the biggest reputational power? I'm going to send my son. And my son's going to go and talk to those renters, and they will respect my son. Well, guess what? They didn't respect the son either. Well, let me ask you, why did Jesus tell the parable? Did he tell the parable so that generations later could read that parable and say to themselves, right on, God, you are so just. You kicked those sons of guns out. You are so good. They were so bad. And I'm glad it's not us, because we would have been totally different. Is that why Jesus told the parable? So that generations later could feel good about themselves? I don't think so. I don't think that's why he told the parable. Or think of another parable. 2 Samuel. David has just taken Bathsheba by killing her husband. And Nathan the prophet goes to David and says, David, I got something to tell you. There were these 2 landowners, and one had this huge farm and had lots of cows and sheep and all kinds of stuff on it. And then there was this little farmer over here that only had 1 little sheep, and it was kind of a family pet, and everybody loved that little sheep, and it gave them milk. And well, one day the rich guy over here, he was having a guest come and needed some food for that guest. So he went over and stole the sheep of this one over here, killed it, and gave it to his guests. And David gets all outraged and says, who is that person? That person surely must die. And Nathan said, wait for it. And Nathan said, you are the man. Bam! Right between the eyes. And we read that parable and we say, yay, God! Boo, David! And is that why Nathan told the parable? So that years later, we could all gang up on David and say, even kings can't commit adultery. We're so good, you're so bad. Well, it reminds me of another parable that Jesus told. And he said, 2 people went up to the temple to pray, a Pharisee and a tax collector. And the Pharisee said, I thank my God that I'm not like everybody else, because they're so awful and I'm so good. And the other fellow just lifted up, put his head down and said, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. And Jesus said, that's the one who really had his prayer answered. So, when Scripture gives us these parables, I would maintain it is not so that we, generations later, can sit in judgment on the people to whom the parable was told. Wasn't the purpose. The purpose was so that the people at the time would see, hear, and change, and that the people later on who also heard the parable would also see, hear, and change. So think about how Jesus ended that parable. He said, the landowner is going to take all those bad renters and throw them out and put in some new renters, and the new renters will work the farm. Guess who the new renters are? Us! God kicked the old renters out and put us in. So now, think about the parable in a slightly different way and think about God saying it to us. Because God has given us this vineyard for us to work in. Think about it. Think about the care and the compassion that the landowner had. Think about everything that he did to prepare that vineyard. It says the landowner went in, dug up all the land, put in all the vines, built a hedge around it to keep out all the wild animals, put a watchtower in it so that you could see afar from any marauders that were coming, and presumably built a nice house where the renters could live, and provided them with absolutely everything that they could possibly need. In our generation, has God done that for us? Absolutely. Think of all the richness that God has provided for you and for me. The land in which we live, the church that we participate in, it is abundant. It is rich. We do not have, as in some other countries, people who want to blow up our church. So that every time we go to church, we have to wonder, is this going to be the day the big one comes? Is this going to be the day that they're going to bomb our church and kill everybody in it? We don't have to think about that. We don't have to think about, is somebody, because we are Christians and go to church, is somebody going to kidnap our kids and kill them? We don't have to think about that. We have been provided by God with the absolute best that God has for us. What's our response? Often I find the response is we get to the point where we expect it. It's no longer a privilege, it's a right. That when we come to church on Sunday morning, we expect that it's going to be climate controlled, not too hot. It's a little warm today, so we might have to do something about that. It's getting a little warm in here. But we expect that it's going to be nice and comfy. We're going to have the lights on. We're going to have a great worship team that's going to lead us. We're going to have wonderful leadership. And we come to expect that. You see, in my terminology, I think we've gone from, now I can't even think of the word. That's why I write these things out, so I'll remember some of these things. Yeah, if only I can find it. Yeah, there it is. We've gone from the age of enlightenment to the age of entitlement. Ever notice how people in our generation feel entitled? That we're special. We don't have to follow the rules. We're different from everybody else. And if you knew how special I was, you would not make me follow the same rules everybody else does. Red light means stop. Well, it may mean stop for you, but if you knew how important I am, and if you knew the business that I was on today and how late I am, you would not hold me because I'm entitled. I'm entitled to go through the red light. We have that sense, sometimes we have that sense of entitlement about our Christian faith. Our Christian faith that says, We're better than everybody else. God has blessed us, and so we expect better because we're Christian people. The age of entitlement. And God is saying, wait a minute, whose land is it? Do you own this? Or are you renters? And he wants to remind us that everything that we have is not something that is our due. It is a gift from God. The second thing I hear in this passage is the great trust that the landowner had for the renters. Because the landowner put the renters in, and then it says, went away. We could do a whole sermon series on the absence of God. And did God put us here and then walk away? And did God leave us alone in the midst? Well, I could talk for a long time about that, but let me give you just this much. Have you ever had a manager at work that you would call a micromanager? Ever had somebody who comes and as you're working away at your desk, your manager comes and just peers over your shoulder? And every now and then, you're working away, doing your job, and every now and then the manager will say, And you look over and say, what? Oh, nothing. And so you continue working away, and then your manager says, oh. Hey, what? What are you on about? No, nothing. Until finally you look at your manager and you say, so what would you do? And your manager said, well, I wouldn't do it that way at all. Here, let me show you how I would do it. I would do it by this, and this, and then you go down. Is God like that? That is not my personal sense of the nature of God. I do not sense God looking over my shoulder at every single decision that I make. And God saying, I wouldn't do it that way. Are you sure? I think God gives us huge amounts of freedom to be able to make choices. Does that mean all our choices are good choices? No, they're not. Are there times when God is saddened by our choices? Absolutely. But I see God being there to say, remember, I'm the one that ultimately is in charge. I'm here, and if you need help, let me know. It's up to us to decide this is one of those situations where I really need help. I don't want to do this one on my own. I want to have the presence of God with me in the midst of all that. Ultimately, the parable ends with the landowner saying, guess what, renters? I've come to collect. I've come to get back what you owe me after all this time that you have lived in the benefits that I have given you. And sometimes, as landowners, do we ever say, well, thanks for asking, but no, I kind of got quite comfy in what I have right now. I don't think there's anything really that I need to give back. Well, there was a person who wrote a letter, wrote an article that was to be published in a journal. And the editor had to read this article and figure out whether he was going to actually publish the article or not. And as he read through the article, he thought, no, this is not something I can publish. So have you ever had to send a rejection letter when someone has asked to publish something and you've said no? Listen to this rejection letter that was sent. We have read your manuscript with boundless delight. If we were to publish your paper, says the editor, it would be impossible for us to publish any work of lower standard. And as it is unthinkable that in the next 1,000 years we shall see its equal, we are, to our regret, compelled to return your divine composition and beg you 1,000 times to overlook our short-sightedness and timidity. Now, there's a rejection letter. Is it not at times that we say to God, well, we have worked so hard in this vineyard that we have produced absolutely the finest fruit that you have ever imagined, and we would not want to ruin your palate by giving you some of this fruit, because after you've tasted the fruit that we have to give you, you will never be able to eat fruit again. And we would not want that for you, so we're not going to give you any of our fruit. Thank you very much. Is that not in part what at times the Christian church says back to God? Well, we have been given such luxury by God. A wonderful church that goes out from this place and touches so many lives that I don't know about, not even all that Kim knows about. The number of lives that are touched by what happens in this place is unbelievable. And that's the kind of fruit that God is looking for. To be able to say that the vineyard, the kingdom, is expanding by what we're doing. May that be so for us. May that be so that the kingdom of God, the vineyard that God has planted us in, is actually extending because of who we are, how Christ is active in our life, and how the Christian church has blessed us, that we are going out to bless others. Jesus told another parable, and he said the fellow gave to his servants. To some he gave this much money, and to some he gave this much money, and to some he gave this much money. And then after a while he came back and said, well, show me an accounting of what you've done. And the one who had this much money said, well, I made this much with it. He said, well, good for you, well done. And to another one he said, well, you gave me this much money and I've made this much money out of it. Terrific. And he came to the one and said, well, I knew you were a hard man, and so I was afraid, and I took everything you gave me, and I dug a hole and I buried it, and here it is, safe and sound, back for you. And the point of the parable is to say those who have been given much, from those much is required. We have indeed been given much. May we be a people who say to God when God comes to collect the rent, we will give you freely and willingly of all the fruit that has come from this place, because ultimately it is yours, O God, and it has been our privilege to work in your vineyard. Amen.